Hello and welcome to Biology 3665, Form, Function, and Adaptation in Animals. My name is Mark Howell. I'll be teaching this course alongside Professor Farmer. Today we'll be introducing Module 1, which will measure your hopping frequency, and we'll be discussing the hardware, the software, and the techniques you'll be using in order to complete this lab. We'll be using a microcontroller called the Blackboard in this class. A microcontroller is just a miniature standalone computer that we'll use for data collection. We'll connect to that a 3-axis accelerometer that will allow us to measure movements in the X, Y, and Z planes. On the software side, we'll be using something called Arduino, just a program that allows us to interact with the microcontroller and change how it functions, as well as Excel to plot and analyze the data that you gather. This is the Blackboard we'll be using in class. Up top here, we've got a row of digital pins. On the bottom is a row of analog pins, and then we also have our pins that are power and control voltage for the board. We don't really need to worry about any of that right now. There's just 2 ports that I want you to pay attention to. On the left-hand side, we've got USB-C. That's how you'll connect the Blackboard to your laptops or computers. And then on the right-hand side is what's called a quick port. This allows us to connect sensors to the Blackboard very easily without having to use, all of these ports. This is the accelerometer we'll be using. You can see it has 2 quick ports here. It doesn't matter which of these you use, they go straight through the board, and that allows us to chain multiple sensors together to get different kinds of reading on a data collection project. The brains of the accelerometer are right here. It's a little chip that will output a signal depending on which way this board moves. Our sensor will output in a unit called G's. You might remember from physics that the kind of force experienced by a mass on Earth is equal to its mass times gravity. And our gravity here on Earth is 9.81 meters per second squared. So this is what is defined as 1G. If you think about being on Earth, you're always going to be experiencing that acceleration. And that's why when you plug this sensor in and just leave it flat on a table, you'll notice that the Z is always going to be about 1G. There are also many other types of sensors that we can use with this Blackboard, and you might be able to utilize those in a final project. Things that'll measure temperature, pressure, motion like the accelerometer that you've been given, and other environmental factors as well, like air pollution or ultraviolet or infrared light. We'll be using a program called Arduino in order to interact with the Blackboard and the sensors that you'll be using in this course. The IDE here stands for Integrated Development Environment. This is kind of a catch-all term for programs where you're writing code that then gets compiled to machine code and becomes an executable program. You're not expected to know what's going on here just yet, but as an intro, this top section here contains our software dependencies. These are code files that are required for the rest of this program to run. I've got some initial values here for our acceleration in units of G's. This here, the sample rate, will be the one thing that you will want to adjust in your code. This is the number of times per second the Blackboard will take a reading from the accelerometer and output that to the serial monitor. And then we have 2 other sections here. The setup, which runs one time at the beginning when the board turns on, and then loop, which will run continuously until the board loses power. Before we get into examining the signals that we'll be reading from the Blackboard, I'd like to take a step back and give a brief overview of what the microcontroller is doing when we're reading data from it. Here, you might remember, is a basic sine wave. It's a periodic function, but it looks a lot like some of the standard signals that we'll be reading with a microcontroller. The sine wave has a period that's determined from the beginning to the end of each waveform that has a repeating pattern. And then we also have an amplitude that determines, in like audio, this would be your volume, or how large of a signal that we're reading. When we're reading data from a sensor, we need to understand how fast or slow we need to take those readings, and that's how we get into sampling rate. If we take too fast of readings, we're sort of overwhelming the system. Our data files are just going to be too big. And if it's too small, we're not going to be able to capture the true shape of our signal. Here I've chosen a sample rate of 1 second. So every 1 second, I tell the microcontroller to give me the data that it has to show me, and it will output that over to the serial monitor. If we draw a line from each of those points, we see that our calculated signal, going from 1 sample per second, shows no signal at all. So we've chosen something that's much too slow for this particular signal. If we increase this to 4 samples every second, or a sample every 250 milliseconds, we begin to see that there is a wave there, but because we still have a pretty slow sampling rate, we don't get the curves of the original sine wave. This phenomenon is called aliasing, and we can see it here in this comparison. On the left is a smooth, continuous signal, but when we only take a couple of discrete samples from that signal, we end up with a jagged, kind of pixelated recreation. This is kind of very relevant in the gaming world, where you'll often hear anti-aliasing, where they would take this signal on the right, which would be the character models, and kind of add in extra things on it as like an in-between layer in order to get a little bit closer to our original signal. When recording our signals, a good rule of thumb is just to use a frequency that's about 10 times that of whatever your expected signal is. So in this case, your hopping frequency. That should give us enough steps that we won't lose any of the peaks or valleys, and we should be able to reconstruct that signal. This is an example of the actual data you'll see coming out of the accelerometer after it's plotted. I was just shaking this up and down. I don't think there's any way I could get to a hopping frequency of, I think this would be 4 hops a second or so. Next, we'll actually start the process of gathering data. You want to load up the Arduino program on your laptops and go into File, Sketchbook, and the program I've written is called Hopping Frequency. This should already be pre-installed on the computers that you check out from the library. With the program now loaded, we'll want to start communicating with the Blackboard. In order to do that, you'll want to go down to Tools and the Board menu, and we'll want to select this Arduino Uno, since the Blackboard is sort of another version of that same board. And making sure that your Blackboard is plugged in with the USB-C cable to your laptop, go down to the Port menu, and you should see probably just one single port here. If you see multiple ones, it should be the highest numbered port that the Blackboard is on. A bit of a note on how to mount your Blackboard. Right here we're using a separate little microcontroller that we had for prototyping, but to mount your Blackboard to your body, you'll want a setup that maybe is a little bit something like this. The main thing is you want to make sure that this quick wire between the two boards isn't going to be moving around, and that the accelerometer itself isn't going to be moving separately from your body when you're hopping up and down. You can use tape on these, just make sure it's a kind of tape that wouldn't leave adhesive behind, so nothing like duct tape or even like packing tape, but Painter's tape would work, gaff tape would work. Right here we're using some medical tape. An alternate way of maybe doing this would be if you've got a beanie to place both the boards, inside the beanie on the top of your head. That might be able to get a nice level reading from the accelerometer. The main thing here is we don't want these two boards to touch because they might end up shorting out. And then any tape or any kind of method that you're using to adhere it or to stick it, you don't want there to be any metal. So don't use like a metal tape because that could also cause these to short out. Now that you've ensured that you can communicate with the board, we'll be able to actually upload this program to the Blackboard and start taking a look at your data. What you'll need to do first is this button right here, that's the arrow pointing to the right. That's the upload button. That will take this code, check to make sure everything is okay in it, and it will upload that to the board itself. And then after it's been uploaded, we'll want to click this little magnifying glass that opens up the serial monitor and allows us to look at the data that's going between the Blackboard and your laptop. When you open up the serial monitor, this is what the data will look like. It might be a little bit hard to read if you're using a really high sample rate. So to get around that, you can hit this auto scroll checkbox. That will pause the window from updating. It'll keep scrolling down below it, but it allows you to see the data. We can see here we've got our X, our Y, and our Z axes. And our Z axis is just shown about 1G. That's because I was gathering data with this accelerometer just sitting flat on a table. We've got our magnitude data that I'll get into in just a second, and our time data that you'll need as part of determining the hopping frequency. When you're ready to start gathering data, because we don't want all of this junk in here before you start hopping, you can hit the clear output button. It'll clear all the data that's been collected so far and start over from the beginning, and then you can hop right at that point. Our magnitude term here is determined from this vector magnitude equation. What this allows us to do is if you're unable to attach the accelerometer to your body such that the z-axis is vertical up and down, this will allow you to just get an idea of the magnitude of the acceleration in total, but not in any single direction. And so it allows you to at least still see the peaks of your hops. You just won't get the proper X, Y, and Z orientation. After you've finished gathering your hopping data, you want to click this send button right here. That sends a blank character back to the Blackboard, and that's a signal to stop the data collection process. Then click anywhere inside this window, hit Control A, that should highlight and select all the data, and then Control C, and that should copy it into the clipboard. Now that we're over in Excel, you'll want to just click into an empty cell that's on the top row, row number 1 here, and hit Control V. That will paste in your data set from the serial monitor. And it's smart enough to know that there's a tab character between each of these values, so it automatically separates that out into each value. You'll also want to make sure that when this gets imported, that your first row here is a full line of data, as well as the very last row. If those are just partial and like incomplete, if it doesn't have the X and Y values, or if it doesn't have magnitude and time, you want to go ahead and right click on the actual row number and then hit delete that row, and that'll get rid of all of that data. In order to graph this data, we really just need 2 of these columns. The first will probably be the z-axis. You'll use this if you can mount the accelerometer flat on your body somehow, maybe like on the top of your head. That'll be ideal. And then we would also need the time component. if you can't mount the accelerometer to your body easily, like if you have to have it sitting vertically or sitting at a weird angle, we can also use this magnitude term. There's a little bit of a caveat on using that we'll get into in a moment, but that is just the total magnitude of all the x, y, and z together. So if you were jumping forward and backward, you would still get that magnitude term and you wouldn't see anything on the z-axis. To create our graph in Excel, you'll first want to go to the Insert tab up at the top and then select this line chart, and you can just use the very basic line chart here since our data set is pretty basic. After clicking the chart button, you'll see it's going to create a bit of a mess here because it's trying to use all the data that we've got. But really, we're just looking for, these two columns here. So what you need to do is right-click just anywhere, say here on the chart, and go to Select Data. We'll want to start from scratch, so just go ahead and click Remove on all three of these series. And then we'll just get a blank template, and then we'll move on and select the correct data that we're looking for. After you've cleared out your default data, you'll just want to click the Add button here, and then we'll add in the data that we're looking for our experiment. We'll obviously want a name for our series. I'm using acceleration, but you could use hopping data or frequency or just whatever you'd like. Then you also want to click into our series values here, delete the value that's there, and then you'll want to highlight and then click and drag the entire column that you're using, and you'll want to have it scroll continuously down to the bottom so that you get all those values. Now we have our proper acceleration data in here, but by default Excel will think each of these sets of data is just spaced 1 unit apart, so 1 second apart. So we'll actually have to go through and edit this here in the horizontal axis. Now we'll just have to do the same thing here with the time. So, highlight that. It's probably going to be empty to start with. Then click and drag to select all of our time data. After hitting OK, you should have a chart that looks a little bit something like this. Your peaks are probably going to be a little bit farther spaced out. I was just shaking this accelerometer by hand, so it's really a pretty fast frequency. It's a little bit weird having this chart kind of just in here and kind of small. So what you want to do is kind of right click, outside the chart area, but still in the chart. You want to select this Move Chart, and then we'll want to put this into a new sheet so that it's just by itself. Here's what our graph looks like as it's separated out. What we're going to want to look at is each of these peaks. If you just hover over with your mouse on the peaks, it'll show you these values. The value here is the G value from the z-axis, and our series 0.1, that 6.21, that's the seconds. That's what you're going to really want to note here, that for each of these peaks, you're going to want to note that value, and then we'll use those values to figure out what your hopping frequency is. Before I was telling you there might be a couple issues if you use that magnitude term instead of the z-axis. Here's what that looks like. The magnitude is in orange, the z-axis is in blue, and for this graph, it's completely fine. The issues would arise if your signal ever drops below 0. The magnitude can never go below 0, so instead of going, dipping like this, it actually goes down, back up, and down and up. So you just want to make sure that if this ever happens, you would ignore these kind of peaks in the curve and only use these peaks right here. From the graph, I've taken all of those peaks and just manually written down the times here, just alongside the other data. Now we can determine our hopping frequency with this. To get the time between our hops, we'll just want to click into this cell just to the right of our times and enter a formula in the formula bar. So this is equals, and then you want to click the second time minus the first time and hit enter, and then this will automatically calculate what the time difference is between those two hops. For my initial value here, I got 0.63 seconds. And what you can do is, rather than doing this for every single one of these times, is just hover over this bottom section of this bar and then click and drag down and then release, and it will auto-populate all the rest of these with the proper formula. So you can see I was pretty consistent here just by hand. Your results may vary a little bit. The graphs that I've been showing you so far are what's called a synthetic data set. We kind of fake the jumping by moving the accelerometer up and down with your hand. But biomechanically, human jumping is a little bit more complicated. So here's a graph of one jump that I made. And you see that there's a lot going on here. First, you have this little peak here. That's when I'm actually crouching down slightly, bending my knees, getting ready, pause for a moment, and then this is your actual jump up. We reach the apex of the jump, and then as we're descending down, the acceleration goes down, and then this is where I'm hitting the ground, and then I get a little bit of a rebound section. So this isn't actually a second jump right here, it's still part of the first one. So when you're going through your data set, you'll kind of have to look at how these curves really turn out and look. And if I were to say, I would say that the period of this jump is probably from here to here. And then we can calculate our time that way. Finally, the main three things to remember here is that whenever you change this sample frequency, you'll need to re-upload that code to the Blackboard, or else it'll just use the frequency you had last time. And when gathering data, make sure to clear your output before you start hopping, and once you're done, click send to stop that data collection process.